Jamal had always been a curious, quiet kid, the kind who often wandered the streets in search of something to fill his time. Halloween night was his favorite, the costumes, the laughter, and of course the candy. As he approached Mrs. Carmichael's house, he had no idea that his innocent request for a piece of candy would soon lead to a situation far bigger than he could understand. Mrs. Carmichael was a woman in her late 60s, living alone since her husband passed away years ago. Her house, though old and creaky, stood as a symbol of the neighborhood's past, its charm long faded but still there. The last time Jamal had visited her was when he was just a toddler, playing on the sidewalk with other kids. Now, at 10, he was more independent, but he still remembered the kindness she'd shown back then. But tonight, something felt off. Mrs. Carmichael had looked at him as though seeing a ghost, her hand trembling when she reached for the door handle. Jamal didn't understand why, but something in her eyes made him hesitate. Jamal took a step back, confused by the sudden chill in the air, the way Mrs. Carmichael's eyes flickered nervously over his shoulder. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. He stood there for a moment, wondering if he'd said something wrong, but the silence only stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Then, just as quickly, she slammed the door shut. The sound was so jarring it almost echoed in his ears. Jamal stood frozen on the porch, heart pounding. What had just happened? His feet instinctively shuffled backward, but he didn't want to leave without understanding. He had always been the kid who asked too many questions, and tonight was no different. As Jamal turned to head home, he spotted Mr. Lawson across the street, standing in his yard, watching the whole thing. Mr. Lawson had always been the kind of neighbor who kept to himself, rarely spoke unless it was about the weather or the grass needing mowing. But tonight, there was something strange in his posture, something too deliberate about the way he was staring. Jamal's thoughts raced. Had he seen something happen at Mrs. Carmichael's house before? The strange look in her eyes, the way she'd shut the door so abruptly, it wasn't normal. Jamal was no stranger to the way people acted when they were hiding something. He could feel it in his gut. His curiosity was stronger than the unease that tugged at him. He walked slowly down the street, the weight of Mr. Lawson's gaze never leaving him. As Jamal passed Lawson's yard, the older man finally spoke, his voice low but sharp. "You should stay away from that house, kid." Jamal froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. Mr. Lawson didn't elaborate, just turned and disappeared into his house without another glance. Jamal stood there, puzzled. The neighborhood was small, tight-knit even, so when someone said something like that, it wasn't just a passing comment. There was a story behind it, something hidden beneath the surface. He wasn't sure how, but Jamal knew he had to figure it out. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just about a piece of candy. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something bigger than what he could understand. The next day, he kept replaying the events in his head. Mrs. Carmichael's behavior, Mr. Lawson's warning, it was all connected, but how? He couldn't let it go. Not now. After school, he walked down the same street, watching Mrs. Carmichael's house from a distance. The windows were dark, closed off, like she was hiding inside. But he knew there was more to the story. He could feel it in his bones. Without thinking, he crossed the street and approached the house. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, the kind of eerie silence that made his skin prickle. Jamal didn't know what he was expecting, maybe a glimpse of Mrs. Carmichael, or even a sign of life. But there was nothing. The house loomed over him, its peeling paint and overgrown hedges giving it a sense of abandonment. He was just about to turn and leave when he saw it, a small, cracked window on the side of the house, almost hidden behind a thick vine. The glass was dirty, but there was a faint light flickering inside. Something shifted in the shadows, but it was hard to tell what. He wasn't sure if he should go any closer, but his feet moved before his brain could stop him. He crouched down beside the window, holding his breath, trying to steady his hands. The inside of the house was dark, save for that one flickering light, but what caught his attention was a shadow moving across the floor. It was fast, jerky, almost like someone was pacing back and forth. Jamal's heart began to race. Suddenly, the door to the house creaked open. Jamal ducked down, pressing himself against the cold, rough wall. His pulse thudded in his ears. He peeked up, his heart stopping when he saw Mrs. Carmichael standing at the door, staring straight ahead. She didn't seem to notice him. Her eyes were distant, as if she was lost in some thought, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly that her knuckles were white. Then, just as quickly, she stepped back inside and closed the door behind her, leaving only the flickering light to tell him someone was still there. Jamal felt a chill creep down his spine. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to know what was going on inside that house, and this time he wasn't going to leave until he found out. But as he took a step toward the door, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to find Mr. Lawson, standing in the middle of the street, watching him. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a hard, knowing look. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You don't know what you're dealing with, kid," Lawson said, his words thick with warning. "Some things are better left alone." Jamal's stomach dropped. Everything in him screamed to run, but his feet were frozen. "What's going on?" Jamal asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why won't anyone tell me?" For a long moment, Lawson just stared at him, his face unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his house, leaving Jamal standing there, more confused than ever. The tension in the air was unbearable, like something was about to break, something big. Jamal stood there for a long time, staring at Mrs. Carmichael's house. The mystery was deeper than he'd thought, and now it seemed like the whole neighborhood was hiding something. He couldn't back down now. Whatever it was, he was going to uncover it, even if it meant going against everything he'd been taught to fear. The truth was waiting, and Jamal was determined to find it. Jamal stood frozen, the weight of Mr. Lawson's words hanging heavy in the air. The longer he stared at the house, the more unsettled he became. Something wasn't right, and his gut told him it had nothing to do with Halloween, or candy, or even Mrs. Carmichael herself. It was something older, buried deep, and now Jamal couldn't escape the feeling that the whole neighborhood was caught in a tangled web. Suddenly, he heard a faint rustling behind him, like footsteps creeping through the leaves. His heart skipped a beat, and he spun around. There, emerging from the shadows, was someone he hadn't expected to see. It was Sarah, his older sister, her face tense, eyes darting nervously around the street. "What are you doing here?" Jamal hissed, instinctively taking a step back. He had no idea why she was here, but the way she looked at him, like she was afraid, made the pit in his stomach deepen. "I was looking for you," Sarah whispered urgently, glancing over her shoulder. "We need to talk." Jamal's brow furrowed, but before he could respond, Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the alleyway that ran behind the houses. The tension was thick, and he could barely understand what was happening. His sister was always calm, always collected, but tonight she looked terrified. "What's going on, Sarah?" Jamal asked, trying to keep his voice low. "What aren't you telling me?" Sarah looked around one more time, as if making sure no one was listening, before pulling him closer. "You were right," she whispered. "There's something off about Mrs. Carmichael's house. Something none of us want to remember." Jamal's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I'm not supposed to tell you this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "But I overheard Mom talking to Mr. Lawson a few days ago. About the house, about the history. They were saying things, Jamal. Things way." Before she could finish, the sound of tires screeching interrupted them. Both siblings froze, the noise cutting through the air like a warning bell. The old station wagon they had seen driving through the neighborhood several times before appeared, slowly turning the corner. Jamal could see the familiar faces of Mr. Lawson and another man sitting in the front seat, their faces obscured by the shadows of the car. Sarah's grip tightened on his arm, pulling him back further into the darkness of the alley. Her eyes were wide with panic now. "You don't understand. It's not just Mrs. Carmichael. It's everything. They're all part of it. Jamal's head was spinning. He couldn't piece it together. Too many secrets, too many mysteries, too many people acting strangely. He turned to Sarah, desperate for answers. "What do you mean, part of it?" he asked. But Sarah's lips trembled as she shook her head. "It's too late now. They know you're here. You need to stay away, Jamal." Before he could respond, the car slowly rolled past them, and Jamal caught a glimpse of the man sitting in the passenger seat. His face was gaunt, hollow, with eyes that seemed to bore right through him. For a brief second, their eyes locked, and Jamal felt his heart race with dread. The car was gone in an instant, but the fear lingered. Sarah grabbed Jamal's hand again, pulling him further into the shadows, her breath quick and shallow. She didn't stop until they reached the end of the alley, where a small door led into their old house. "Go inside," she ordered, voice low and urgent. "Stay away from that house. Don't ask anyone anything. Just forget about it." Jamal's thoughts were a mess, his mind racing with questions. He wanted to know more, to dig deeper into the web of lies that seemed to have been spun around him. But his sister's fear was real, and it was enough to stop him for now. The stakes had risen, and whatever was happening in that house, whatever his sister was so terrified of, it wasn't something he could face alone. But the questions still gnawed at him. What had Mrs. Carmichael, Mr. Lawson, and even his own family been hiding? And more importantly, why had they been keeping it from him? The answers felt just out of reach, but Jamal could feel them pulling him closer to the edge, where everything he thought he knew would come crashing down. Jamal didn't sleep that night. His mind wouldn't let him. The more he thought about it, the more he felt the weight of the secret pushing down on him. Sarah's words, the strange look from Mr. Lawson, the flickering light in Mrs. Carmichael's house. It was all tangled together, and he knew he couldn't back down now. Something was going to happen, and it was coming closer. At dawn, he slipped out of the house. Sarah was still asleep, but Jamal knew he had to face this alone. He couldn't keep running. He wasn't going to be scared anymore. He walked down the street toward Mrs. Carmichael's house, his footsteps quiet in the early morning stillness. This time, he wasn't afraid of what he might find. If he had to uncover the truth, he would do it now. The door was still closed, but the same eerie light flickered through the cracks in the window, casting strange shadows on the old walls. Jamal stood in front of the door, his heart hammering. He reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, as though it was expecting him. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the smell of something old, like it hadn't been touched in years. He stepped in cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. The house was dark, the only light coming from the small flickering bulb in the hallway. As he walked deeper into the house, he noticed the pictures on the walls. Old, faded photographs of people he didn't recognize. But what struck him the most was the photo of Mrs. Carmichael standing with a man, his face obscured by shadows. There was something in the way she looked at him, something familiar, something that made Jamal's stomach churn. Suddenly, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, expecting to see Mrs. Carmichael, but instead, it was Mr. Lawson, his face grim and dark. "I told you to stay away," Lawson said, his voice cold and hard. "You should have listened." Jamal felt a rush of fear, but refused to let it control him. What is this place? What are you all hiding? Mr. Lawson didn't answer immediately. He just stared at Jamal with those piercing eyes. Finally, he sighed. "It's not what you think. You're in danger now, kid." Before Jamal could respond, Mrs. Carmichael appeared from the shadows, her frail frame almost ghost-like in the dim light. "It's time you knew the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to drag anyone into this, but it's too late now." Jamal took a step back, confusion and fear battling inside him. What truth? What's really going on here? Mrs. Carmichael slowly walked toward him, her eyes heavy with guilt. "This house, it was built on something dark, Jamal. Something we thought we could leave behind. But it's still here, in the walls, in the floorboards. It's in all of us." The words hit Jamal like a punch. He could feel his pulse quicken, his hands shaking. What do you mean, in all of us? Mrs. Carmichael closed her eyes for a moment, then spoke in a whisper. The man in the photo, the one with me, he was my brother. We thought he died years ago, but he didn't. He came back, Jamal. Not as a person, but as something else. Something that lives in the shadows, in the cracks of this house. It's been using all of us, feeding off our fears, our guilt, our secrets. Jamal's mind raced. It didn't make sense. What does that have to do with me? Why now?